This is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com, and I'm very excited to tell you that we are going to be talking about the historicity of Jesus and whether or not we have enough information that supports the historicity of Jesus. And so I have been provided with some pretty interesting stuff from Stephen Rivard. It's a video that actually discusses some of this, and I'm going to talk about that extra biblically, but I'm also going to provide some internal evidence for the historicity. So yes, Stephen Steen, we are on. So I'd like to start a little bit early. So sorry if anybody thought I wasn't going to start early. Hey, Converse Contender, great to see you guys. It's always fun at Converse. Great job mediating all those times when you get in there, or moderating, I should say, all those times when you get in there in the debates. So great seeing you guys. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to play a bit here. So let me just shimmy on over to this really cool little podcast. So. Okay, so the question is, do we have enough evidence? So let's see what the answer is. The answer is, of course, yes, we do. We have tons of it. So this is going to give us some details on some of the extra biblical support that we have. Here we go.
I would like to present to you a case for the historical existence of Jesus. Lately, there have been many people who have been claiming that there is no evidence to verify his actual existence. It has become so widely claimed by recent speakers that most of us take for granted what we have been told, although it is rare to find anyone who has actually looked for themselves to verify this claim. First, you should know that this view is a new one. All throughout history, skeptics used to claim that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, or that his miracles were only parlor tricks, or that the disciples stole his body from the tomb, but they never claimed he didn't exist. Claiming that he never existed only became possible recently due to the long period of time that has passed since the first century. In the same way, right now it would be ludicrous to say that your great-grandfather never existed, but 1900 years later it would be easy to convince someone of it. In actuality, there is much more evidence for Jesus' existence than there is for almost any important or famous person of that time. In this presentation, we will be using only non-biblical evidence. In other words, we won't be using the Bible to prove the Bible. We will also be stopping after every account to address the typical skeptical questions about each claim. I warn you though, if you watch this video, you will no longer be able to believe that there is no evidence for the existence of Jesus, and you might even start to question the integrity of the research of those that have told you that there isn't. I will be quoting from a website called thedivineevidence.com, and I will link it in the description section of this video. Cornelius Tacitus lived from 55 to 120 AD. Tacitus was a 1st and 2nd century Roman historian who lived through the reigns of over half a dozen Roman emperors. Considered one of the greatest historians of Rome, Tacitus verifies the biblical account of Jesus' execution at the hands of Pontius Pilate, who governed Judea from 26 to 36 AD. during the reign of Tiberius. Tacitus writes the following: Christus, the founder of the Christian name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. But the pernicious superstition, repressed for a time, broke out again, not only through Judea, where the mischief originated, but through the city of Rome also. It would confirm the following: that Jesus did exist, that he was the founder of Christianity, that Jesus was put to death by Pilate, that Christianity originated in Judea with Jesus, and that Christianity later spread to Rome. Skeptic Interjection 1. Could Tacitus have taken his information from Christian sources? Answer: because of his position as a professional historian and not as a commentator, it is more likely that Tacitus referenced government records over Christian testimony. It is also possible Tacitus received some of his information from his friend and fellow secular historian Pliny the Younger. Yet, even if Tacitus referenced some of Pliny's sources, it would be out of his character to have done so without critical investigation. An example of Tacitus criticizing testimony given to him even from his dear friend Pliny is found here in Annals 55. Tacitus distinguishes between confirmed and hearsay accounts almost 70 times in his history. If he felt this account of Jesus was only rumor or folklore, he would have issued his usual disclaimer that this account was unverified, but he did not. Skeptic interjection 2. Could this passage have been a Christian interpolation or forgery? Answer. Judging by the critical undertones of this passage, it is highly unlikely. Tacitus refers to Christianity as a superstition and an insuppressible mischief. Furthermore, there is not a surviving copy of Tacitus's Annals that does not contain this passage. There is no verifiable evidence of tampering of any kind in this passage.
Before he goes on, I want to make a note. I am watching the chat and I'm going to be, of course, commenting. And if anyone has questions, comments, or you want to interject something, feel free to discuss that. But I do want to point out something really important about that Charlie Reed pointed out. He said, hearsay. Now, of course, we already had the refutation of that from the speaker here. But I want to go back to something also just to note. Many of you were not around when Martin Luther King was shot, when Dr. Martin Luther King was shot. Some of you were born after, many of you were born after that. 1968 is the year he was shot. And so would it be possible for you to gather information concerning the life and death eventually of Martin Luther King? Well, of course it would, because you could talk to people who were alive at the time, even though you weren't born at that time. So Tacitus, who was born in the 50s, could easily talk to the contemporaries of Jesus or any other people who also were around during the time when Jesus was walking the earth. Okay, so it's quite easy to do that. And that's only 20 years after Jesus was crucified on 33. So let's continue.
It is highly unlikely. Tacitus refers to Christianity as a superstition and an insuppressible mischief. Furthermore, there is not a surviving copy of Tacitus's Annals that does not contain this passage. There is no verifiable evidence of tampering of any kind in this passage. Skeptic interjection 3. Why is this passage not quoted by the early church fathers? Answer. Due to the condescending nature of Tacitus's testimony, early Christian authors most likely would not have quoted such a source, assuming Tacitus's writings were even available to them. However, our actual answer comes from the context of the passage itself. Nothing in Tacitus's statement mentions anything that was not already common knowledge among Christians. It simply provides evidence of Jesus' existence, which is a topic not debated at this point in history. Let's move on to Lucian of Samosata.
Before he goes on to Lucian, I want to point out something that he's making a really important point. At no point in the early history or in the ancient times is anyone claiming that Jesus was a myth figure or an amalgamon. None of that kind of stuff was claimed. So we don't have, to come up with that stuff was originated in the 18th century, the very first person who posited that. So we've got 1700 years after the event, is well after the event, when somebody posited this idea that Jesus himself never walked the earth and there was not a figure named Jesus. I just found myself today actually in a thread on Twitter where I had corresponded in 2018 with Richard Carrier, who is a big mythicist. And Richard Carrier was basically discounting my views. And somebody picked up on that thread today and was basically continuing this idea that Jesus is merely a myth and a composite figure of a number of different people. And a person who's called Tim O'Neill, I'm no friend of his, but he has a website called History for Atheists. And he's written a bunch of things in support of the fact that Jesus is an historical figure. Even if he denies Jesus' divinity, he does not deny the fact that he was a man in history. And of course, we also know that Mormons, I don't mean Mormons, I mean Muslims, Jewish people, people of other faiths, Hindus, all also acknowledge the fact that Jesus was a man in history. To deny that is actually also to deny history, because we have a number of historians who've also supported this idea. So making the claim of mythicism is, as Stephen Steen is saying, definitely something that is on the level of the flat earth society. Okay, so it's a flat earth comparison. It's a flat earth atheist who makes a claim that Jesus is a mythicist.
Let's move on to Lucian of Samosata. Lucian was a 2nd century Greek satirist and rhetorician who scornfully describes his views of early Christianity. Though he ridicules the Christians and their Christ, his writings confirm Jesus was executed via crucifixion and that he was the founder of Christianity. He says, "The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. It was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship their crucified sage and live after his laws." What this passage reveals and how it confirms the biblical account. 1. That Jesus did exist. 2. That Jesus was the founder of Christianity. 3. Jesus was worshipped by his followers. And 4. That Jesus suffered death by crucifixion. Skeptic Interjection 1. Can we consider Lucian's testimony reliable, due to the source being a literary work? Answer. Lucian's comments revolved around historical events. In Lucian's work, The Way to Write History, he openly criticizes his contemporaries, who distort history to flatter their masters or those who fill in historical gaps with their personal conjecture. He writes, "The historian's one task is to tell the thing as it happened. He may nurse some private dislikes, but he will attach far more importance to the public good and set the truth high above his hate. For history, I say again, has this and only this for its own. If a man will start upon it, he must sacrifice to no God but truth. He must neglect all else." Skeptic Interjection 2. Is it possible Lucian received his knowledge from Christian sources, or that this passage is an interpolation or a forgery? Answer. Seeing how adamant Lucian was in regards to historical accuracy and critical investigation, our answer is an emphatic no. As to the passage being a Christian forgery, chances are that the reference to Jesus would be far more favorable if this were so. Lucian refers to Jesus only as a man, a lawgiver, and a sage. Human, not divine descriptions. He never once refers to Jesus as a god. Furthermore, there isn't anything in the above statement that reveals what wasn't already known. It merely asserts that Jesus lived, preached, and died. Remember, at this time, Christians were trying to prove Jesus' divinity, not his existence. Next, we're going to look at Flavius Josephus. And before we get started on the details of Josephus, I'd like to make a personal comment. And that is that I've heard for a very long time that this Josephus quote was an obvious forgery. But if you look into it, you'll find that there are really only two different versions of this particular account of Josephus's talking about Jesus. He actually talks about Jesus in another account that's not disputed, but this particular one is. And what you'll find is that there's really two versions, and they don't really differ in anything important.
I want to mention, as Stephen Rivard has just also mentioned, this is from Chris White, and I actually don't know the name of the website. He's going to check it out, and I will provide that link and everything else once I get that. So thank you so much. Let's go on. Again, talking about Josephus and the alleged issue in the Josephus that, of course, somebody says that a Christian might have inserted some print. But even if we go and ignore that particular portion of Josephus's writing, we still have support for Christ. So here we go. Of Josephus's talking about Jesus. He actually talks about Jesus in another account that's not disputed, but this particular one is. And what you'll find is that there's really two versions, and they don't really differ in anything important, at least when we're arguing Jesus' existence, because they both admit that he existed, that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, that he had many followers, both Jews and Gentiles, and that he performed what Josephus called. Oh, why'd that do that? Uh-oh. Somehow this went out. Hold on, let me just see if I can get this to come back on. Okay, we're freezing up here. Let me see if I can redo this. Here we go. I would like to present to you a case for the historical existence of Jesus. Okay. Is that it's a very good account from a very prominent historian who lived at that time and would have probably interviewed the apostles themselves. All of that being said, there is a lot to debate and to talk about this particular passage and the other passage that Josephus mentions Jesus in. So let's look into it. This is what was written. Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day.
as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribes of Christians so named for him are not extinct at this day. This is what the other version reads. Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him, and the tribes of Christians so named from him are not extinct to this day. Skeptic Interjection 1. This passage contains proclamations an Orthodox Jew would not make, such as Jesus being the Christ. Answer. In other translations, Greek and Arabic, the suspicious statements contain disclaimers such as Jesus who was believed to be the Christ and it has been reported. This presents the theory that Josephus was recording the beliefs regarding Jesus and not necessarily his personal opinion, as a responsible historian should do. If anything, it could lead to the speculation that Christian authors did not add to the text, but rather edited it by deleting the disclaimers. You should also realize that the earliest versions of Antiquities contain this passage as it is presented in the first case. The objection usually is that the earliest copy is not until the 10th century. However, we do have several citations of this passage by other authors prior to the 10th century. Skeptic Interjection 2. Early Christian authors like Origen and Justin Martyr do not mention this passage in their writings. Answer. I'm not sure what the motive behind this objection is, because Origen does reference the other passage by Josephus, yet critics claim the reference is too late to be reliable. But, for the argument's sake, if we assume this passage did exist in the form most scholars believe it did, the early church fathers might not have felt the need to refer to it. The original passage serves as evidence for the historicity of Jesus, a topic not debated at this point, as the burden of proof revolved around his divinity. We will now examine the second passage given to us by Josephus. Fortunately, it is not surrounded in as much controversy.
Before we do that, I just want to point out I've got a very active chat here, and I just wanted to say, Jesus SD4FR. He says basically that Jesus is against circumcision and diet and that sort of thing, and marrying Gentiles. Well, he's absolutely not against that. Jesus is for a number of different things. One is, yes, he's for the circumcision. Obviously, that's part of the whole deal with tradition. The fact that Paul decided that it wasn't necessary for people to have to go through all of the Jewish customs to become followers of Jesus doesn't mitigate the fact that we have circumcision as something that's traditional and required in the Old Testament. We also have a modification of the diet. You'll notice in Acts 10 that the diet was modified as far as what people could eat. And so Peter had seen this vision where he saw all kinds of different animals, and God said that they are all clean. And we also have an issue with marriage. Jesus basically said that a husband and wife who come together, let no man tear apart. He's very much for marriage. He's very much against divorce. And he's even said, if you go into the 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians and look at the references, he's even said if somebody's married to a non-believer, that both of them are considered sacred together. And he's also said that he doesn't really want people to divorce. So that's a pretty important situation. He's pro-marriage. Okay, so whatever you're coming into the marriage with. Now, it's easier, obviously, if you're a Christian and you marry a Christian, your life's just going to be a lot easier. And the fear is if you do marry somebody who's a non-Christian, that you'll eventually leave the faith. That's one of the reasons why in the Old Testament, when Solomon ended up marrying a bunch of women, he was married to a number of different women who were of different faiths. He ended up starting to worship these other gods, and that was scorned upon. Nobody wants that to happen. And so that's something just to look into.
Not debated at this point, as the burden of proof revolved around his divinity. We will now examine the second passage given to us by Josephus. Fortunately, it is not surrounded in as much controversy. It says, So Aeneas assembled a council of judges, and brought before it the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, whose name was James, together with some others, and having accused them as lawbreakers, he delivered them over to be stoned. Skeptic Interjection 1. Is it possible this passage was a forgery by early Christians? Answer. It must be noted that no copy of Antiquities has ever surfaced without the above text quoted as it is above. Critics are suspicious of the so-called Christ statement, yet this reference, rather than the Christ, shows Josephus was not condoning the belief, but simply documenting it. Also, this passage concerns the actions of the priest Aeneas. Jesus and James were not even the primary focus of this verse. Lastly, this passage is cited in other early works which attest to its authenticity. Even if we dismiss the disputed works in Josephus's testimonium, we still see he testifies to a number of things in the above two passages. One, that Jesus lived in the first century. He performed miracles. Some believed Jesus to be the Christ. He was a teacher. He had many followers. He was tried by Pilate. He was crucified. He was a founder of Christianity. And James was the brother of Jesus.
Next is Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger admits to torturing and executing Christians who refused to deny Christ. Those who denied the charges were spared and ordered to exalt the Roman gods and curse the name of Christ. Pliny addresses his concerns to Emperor Trajan that too many Christians were being killed for their refusal to deny their faith. He says, "I asked them directly if they were Christians. Those who persisted, I ordered away. Those who denied that they were or ever had been Christians worshipped both your image and the image of the gods and cursed Christ. They used to gather on a stated day before the dawn and sing to Christ as if he were a god. All the more I believed it necessary to find out what was the truth from 2 servant maids, which were called deaconesses, by means of torture. Nothing more did I find than a disgusting fanatical superstition. Therefore, I stopped the examination and hastened to consult you, on account of the number of people endangered, for many of all ages, all classes, and both sexes already are brought into danger." In Pliny's letter to Emperor Trajan. Though Pliny states some of the accused denied the charges, a recurring theme in the correspondences between Pliny and Trajan is the willingness of the true believer to die for Christ. This would hardly be reasonable if they knew he never existed. Skeptic Interjection 1. How does dying for one's belief verify the actual existence of Jesus? The sincerity of a belief does not necessarily make the belief true. How does this passage specifically confirm a historical Jesus and not just the existence of Christians in Rome? Answer. Pliny states Christians worshipped Christ as if he were a god. This indicates one who would not normally be considered a god, such as a human, who was exalted to divine status. Also, the early Christians would have been in a position to know if Jesus was a historical figure or not. Though critics can claim these martyrs took Jesus' existence solely on faith, common sense tells us that there would have been a lot more evidence of a historical Jesus at this time than what has been preserved until today. According to early historians, Jesus' great-nephew and other relatives were still alive, as well as the associates of the original apostles. Such individuals could easily verify his existence. Also, documents which have been lost to us were still in existence, such as Jesus' trial records and the census records of his birth, and were even referenced by early authors who wrote about Jesus. These individuals had every reason to be certain of Jesus' existence and were willing to die because of it. Skeptic Interjection 2. Pliny also states some recanted their testimony. Perhaps they did so because they knew Jesus was a myth. Answer. There are several rational explanations as to why some would recant their Christian beliefs. Pliny readily admits to torturing some of the accused. Are admissions or denials really credible under torture? Also, the accused knew if they did not recant, they would be put to death. Fallible human rationalization, confess and go home, and work out the hard feelings with Jesus later, or suffer crucifixion. Also, some of the accused could have been lackadaisical Christians who half-heartedly accepted Christianity because of a spouse, parent, or friend, and would have had no problem reverting back to paganism upon facing persecution. There were half-hearted Christians 2,000 years ago, just like there are half-hearted Christians today. Just because there were some who may have recanted out of fear or poor judgment doesn't dismiss the deaths of the other individuals who were certain of Jesus' existence and died because they refused to curse him.
Next is Celsus. Celsus was a 2nd century Roman author and an avid opponent of Christianity. He went to great lengths to disprove the divinity of Jesus, yet never denied his actual existence. Unfortunately for Celsus, he sets himself up for criticism by mimicking the exact accusations brought against Jesus by the Pharisees, which had already been addressed and refuted in the New Testament. There are two very important facts regarding Celsus which make him one of the most important witnesses in this discussion. Though most secular passages are accused of being Christian interpolations, we can accept with certainty that this is not the case with Celsus. The sheer volume of his writings, specifically designed to discredit Christianity, coupled with the hostile accusations presented in his work, dismiss the chance immediately. Also, the idea of Celsus getting his information entirely from Christian sources, another recurring accusation against secular evidence, is wholly absurd. He is obviously aware of his opponent's belief, as anyone who is engaging in a debate should be. Celsus wrote his exposition in a form of dialogue between a, quote, Jewish critic and himself. This gives us cause to believe that he used non-Christian, probably Jewish, sources. On Jesus' miracles, he writes, Jesus, on account of his poverty, was hired out to go to Egypt. While there, he acquired certain magical powers. He returned home highly elated at possessing these powers, and on the strength of them gave himself out to be a god. It was by means of sorcery that he was able to accomplish the wonders which he performed. Let us believe that these cures, or the resurrection, or the feeding of a multitude with a few loaves, these are nothing more than the tricks of jugglers. It is by the names of certain demons and by the use of incantations that the Christians appear to be possessed of miraculous power. Not only does Celsus confirm Jesus' existence here, he also tries to debate the source of his miracles. Like the Pharisees of Jesus' day, Celsus tries to dismiss these miracles as both demonic possession and cheap parlor tricks. However, he is clearly grasping at straws. On one hand, Celsus accuses Jesus of performing magic learned in Egypt, then later states it is by the power of possession, then states the miracles were not really miracles at all, but were illusionary tricks performed by a deceiver, then finally states that the miracles never occurred.
I want to point out something that I'm just thinking about here in the chat. One of the things that we should also note is we have 42 sources within 150 years of Jesus' resurrection that support the accounts of the New Testament and Jesus' ministry, Jesus' life, his miracles, all sorts of things. So we have 42 sources. Of those sources, 9 are from secular, rather hostile witnesses. That is what is being covered right now from Chris White. He's talking about the secular hostile witnesses towards Jesus who basically talk about him in a more condescending and sneering way. Let us note, though, that we also have a number of Christian sources. Now, logically, if you were living back in ancient times and you had discovered Jesus Christ and you had discovered Christianity and you'd witnessed what people were doing in support of Christianity, such as they were preaching for decades despite being mercilessly beaten and jailed and beheaded and stoned and burned. We have evidence of that, as we mentioned before, from Tacitus, for example, and a number of other people. And so this is what Christians were doing to basically support this idea of Christianity. They were not going to recant Jesus, although as was mentioned from Chris, there were a few people who did. But the ones who were such as Peter, James, Jesus's half-brother, and Paul, these are great examples of people who just kept doing what they were doing for decade after decade. And why did they do that? Because they saw the risen Christ. We don't necessarily need to have these hostile secular sources. We could go to the Christian sources. Those people are the ones who are honest with the information that they received at that point. And they realize that, hey, they're onto something. Something must have been going on. These are the people who are rubbing elbows with those in the towns of people who were freed up from being blind, or people who were brought back to life. All of these other miracles that were occurring were obviously something that was in the presence of many other people. And during this time, the logical movement would be to follow Christianity.
Not only does Celsus confirm Jesus' existence here, he also tries to debate the source of his miracles. Like the Pharisees of Jesus' day, Celsus tries to dismiss these miracles as both demonic possession and cheap parlor tricks. However, he is clearly grasping at straws. On one hand, Celsus accuses Jesus of performing magic learned in Egypt, then later states it is by the power of possession, then states the miracles were not really miracles at all, but were illusionary tricks performed by a deceiver, then finally states that the miracles never occurred. On the virgin birth, he writes, Jesus had come from a village in Judea, and was the son of a poor Jewess who gained her living by the work of her hands. His mother had turned out by her husband, who was a carpenter by trade, on being convicted of adultery with a Roman soldier named Penthria. Being thus driven away by her husband and wandering about in disgrace, she gave birth to Jesus, a bastard. Celsus acknowledges Jesus' birth and existence, but does not accept the concept of a virgin conception. He tries to dismiss Mary's premarital pregnancy as a result of an affair she had with a Roman soldier. Strangely enough, there is a very similar passage in the Jewish Talmud, which makes the same accusation. This gives us reason to believe that Celsus may have referenced Jewish sources for some of his arguments. On the crucifixion, Celsus writes, Jesus accordingly exhibited after his death only the appearance of wounds received on the cross, and was not in reality so wounded as he is described to have been. In this statement, Celsus confirms Jesus' death by crucifixion, although he claims the only wounds Jesus received were those inflicted by the crucifixion, thus denying any previous torture had taken place. But not even history offers Celsus the benefit of the doubt, as floggings were the standard form of torture given to victims prior to the crucifixion. Celsus contradicts himself yet again when he later states that Jesus was probably never even crucified, but instead had an impostor die in his place. Skeptic Interjection 1. Celsus also states, "It is clear to me that the writings of the Christians are a lie, and that your fables are not well enough constructed to conceal this monstrous fiction." So how do we know that Celsus is referring to a historical Jesus and not just debating a myth of Jesus? Answer. Evidence which shows Celsus to be refuting aspects of a historical Jesus is as follows. Number 1. Satisfied with his presentation of evidence, Celsus offers his conclusion that Jesus was only a man, not a myth or a god, as the apostles had claimed. That's pretty clear that he thought that he existed. Number 2, instead of denying the alleged events, Celsus offers alternative theories to the early Christian claims, like the virgin birth being a cover-up for an illegitimate pregnancy, and the miracles actually being the works of sorcery. If he was discussing a mythical character, he would not have needed to go to such lengths, but to merely have dismissed Jesus as a myth. After all, there is no easier way to discredit a religion than to assert its founder never existed. Of course, this is the argument Celsus never makes. Number 3. Celsus refers to his belief that the claims such as the virgin birth and the resurrection were embellishments created by Christians, not that Jesus himself was a myth. Celsus was debating the claims of Jesus' divinity, not his existence. Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus lived from 69 to 130 A.D. Suetonius was a prominent Roman historian who recorded the lives of Roman Caesars and historical events surrounding their reigns. He served as a court official under Hadrian and as an analyst for the imperial house. Suetonius records the expulsion of Christian Jews from Rome, mentioned in Acts 18 verse 2, and confirms the Christian faith being founded by Christ. He says, "As the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Christus, Claudius expelled them from Rome." Skeptic Interjection 1. Because Suetonius misspells Christus as Crestus, is it possible that he was referring to someone else? Answer. Because Crestus was an actual Greek name, critics speculate Suetonius may have been referring to a specific civil agitator. I would like to present a few arguments as to why I feel this is a reference to Jesus. In order to get as close to the author's intent as possible, This is the passage as it exists in the original Latin. Suetonius seems to imply the word Christus as a title, not as a reference to a particular rebel. Though I have seen critics cite the passage as a certain one, Christus, we can see that this is incorrect by the lack of the original quodam in the original Latin. Suetonius uses the word instigation, not instigator. The Latin word referring to an instigator is impulsor, but the term referring to an instigation is impulsore. And this is the word Suetonius uses, thus affirming the belief that he is using the word Christus as a title and not as a name. It was common for both pagan and Christian authors to spell the name using either an E or an I, and we know that the Christian authors were obviously referring to Jesus when they spelled the name Christus. Tertullian criticizes pagan disdain or hate for Christianity and points out the fact that they can't even spell the name correctly. He implies the common misspelling of Christius by their use of the term Christians. He writes, "Most people so blindly knock their heads against the hatred of the Christian name, it is wrongly pronounced by you as Christians, for you do not even know accurately the name you hate. But the special ground of dislike to the sect is that it bears the name of its founder." Apology, chapter 3.
Next is Thallus, unknown to 52 AD. Although his works exist only in fragments, Julius Africanus debates Thallus's explanation of the midday darkness which occurred during the Passover of Jesus' crucifixion. Thallus tries to dismiss the darkness as a natural occurrence, a solar eclipse. But Africanus argues, and any astronomer can confirm, a solar eclipse cannot physically occur during a full moon, due to the alignment of the planets. Phlegon of Tralles, a 2nd century secular historian, also mentions the darkness and tries to dismiss it as a solar eclipse. He also states the event occurred during the time of Tiberius Caesar. This is what was written. "On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness. The rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and the other districts were thrown down. The darkness Thallus, in the 3rd book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. For the Hebrews celebrate the Passover on the 14th day according to the moon, and the Passion of our Savior falls on the day before the Passover. But an eclipse of the sun takes place only when the moon comes under the sun, and it cannot happen at any other time. Phlegon records that, in the time of Tiberius Caesar, at the full moon, there was an eclipse of the sun from the 6th hour to the 9th, manifestly that one of which we speak." Skeptic Interjection 1. Why doesn't Pliny the Elder or Senencia mention this event in their writings? Answer. Pliny focused his writings on natural astronomical events that had physical scientific explanations. It is doubtful that he would have found it necessary to record an event of supernatural origin. I can also find no mention of him being in Judea at the time, so it is doubtful he would have mentioned it if he did not witness the events firsthand.
Seneca focused his writings on dramas, dialogues, and tragedy,
and like Pliny, it is doubtful he was in Judea during this event. Skeptic Interjection 2. Because Thallus's and Phlegon's work exist only in fragments, can their testimonies be considered reliable? Answer. This is something the reader will have to determine on their own. Africanus was an honest, qualified author who did not alter the quotes to serve his own purpose. This is very likely considering what we know about Africanus. Africanus's methods were highly respected by his peers. He was often quoted by other authors. He had even chastised his friend and fellow Christian Origen for citing information from a spurious, unreliable source. It also must be noted that Thallus never said this eclipse did not happen, but instead was trying to actually come up with a scientific explanation to the eclipse instead of assigning it to divine origins.
I want to just piggyback on that for a moment. We also have geological evidence that a lot of scholars have found today that supports this idea that there was an earthquake in the year 33 in the basin in Jerusalem. So they actually have looked at seismite, and they found evidence that there was an earthquake at that time. So it's consistent with the idea that was reported in Matthew's gospel of an earthquake, and of course what we're talking about right now with this eclipse. So a number of different things occurred. One of the major things that occurred with this earthquake and with the eclipse was that the Jewish temple, there was what they call like a veil that actually stood between the doors of the temple and the holiest of holy rooms. And that veil was rent in half, it torn in half. And at that time, that was one of the reasons why the Roman guard was just realized the magnitude of having Jesus on the cross. And he proclaimed that Jesus must have been the Son of God, as he had said. So that was a pretty interesting thing, but just go back and take a look at that. Also, if you haven't done it yet, there's some interesting stuff that's out there in the Babylonian Talmud and in other documents in the ancient times that I've cited before, also by Josephus, that have pointed to the fact that the doors of the temples were opening and closing on their own between the year 30 and the year 70, when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. And so it's pretty notable that people were thinking there was something very godly going on in that temple. The fact that the doors could open on their own, these doors were enormous and very heavy. And for them to be able to do that obviously speaks to something that goes beyond the natural, when nobody naturally is opening and closing the doors themselves.
Only in fragments can their testimonies be considered reliable. Answer: this is something the reader will have to determine on their own. Africanus was an honest, qualified author who did not alter the quotes to serve his own purpose. This is very likely, considering what we know about Africanus. Africanus's methods were highly respected by his peers. He was often quoted by other authors. He had even chastised his friend and fellow Christian Origen for citing information from a spurious, unreliable source. It also must be noted that Thales never said this eclipse did not happen, but instead was trying to actually come up with a scientific explanation to the eclipse instead of assigning it to divine origins.
Next is Mara bar Superian. Mara bar Superian of Syria penned this letter from prison to his son. What advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these three wise men. The Athenians died of hunger, the Samians were overwhelmed by the sea, the Jews, ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates did not die for good. He lived on in the teachings of Plato. Pythagoras did not die for good. He lived on in the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he had given.
I want to point out, I'm looking at the chat right now, and I find something quite amusing. This conversation going on between Charlie Reed and Stephen Steen. Charlie is asserting the fact that is actually saying that, say, a 60-year period is multiple generations. What he's implying here is that the person who's the oldest in the generation, as soon as the one who's born after him is born, that person is no more likely to be able to communicate with anybody else at all. Okay, so that's the assumption going on when you're saying that information's passed down third hand, fourth hand, fifth hand. You assume that the oldest people in the room have stopped talking and communicating just by virtue of the fact that they're younger people in the room. That'd be like saying, okay, I have a son right now, and my son is the only one who's going to be able to communicate a piece of information that he had learned to another person, rather than having me communicate it as an older person. Okay, so that's, and this idea of generations, I think of generations, I tend to think of the word 100 years, but of course I realize, with multiple generations of people, you could have 3 generations or 4 generations of people in a family who are all still around. So I would say that typically in a period of 100 years, you have most people die, after say 78 years or 80 years, something like that. And so this idea that you can't pass down information as soon as you're an older member of the generation seems a little bit stretchy. So that's it. That's my comment on the Charlie Reed, Stephen Steen interaction. We're going back to Chris White. Oops, now it's freezing on me. Hold on, I did that to myself. Okay, let me hold on 1 second here. Bring it back.
I would like as Christians, for you do not even know accurately the on the teaching which he had given. Skeptic Interjection 1. How do we know that this passage is in reference to Jesus?
Hey, Becco.
1. He was Jewish. Jesus was a Galilean Jew. 2. He was executed. Jesus was crucified after the Jews appealed to Pilate to have him crucified. 3. After his death, Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. This occurred in 70 A.D., after Jesus' death. 4. The Jews were dispersed after his death. The Jews abandoned Judea after the Roman attack of 70 A.D. He was a teacher. Jesus was a rabbi or teacher. He lived on after death, and the teachings, Jesus and his teachings were founded the Christian faith. He was a wise king. Jesus was mocked by the Romans as the king of the Jews. The messianic prophecies fulfilled by Jesus referred to the coming Messiah as king. Christians believed that Jesus was their spiritual king. Jesus was born of the royal line of King David. And, of course, he was Jewish. Now, moving on to the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud is an ancient record of Jewish history, laws, and rabbinic teachings compiled throughout the century. Though it does not accept the divinity of Jesus, it confirms the belief that he was hanged, an idiom for crucifixion, on the eve of the Passover. It says, on the eve of the Passover, Yeshu, some texts say Yeshu the Nazarene, was hanged, which means crucified, 40 days before the execution. A herald went forth and cried, he is going forth to be stoned, because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf. But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of Passover. Skeptic Interjection 1. How can we know that the Talmud is documenting Jesus' existence and not only stating the rumor surrounding a myth? Answer. In the above excerpt, the Talmud mentions Jesus' ability to perform miracles, but tries to dismiss it as sorcery. If the writers were simply refuting myth, they would most likely have dismissed the tale as a rumor, not assign alternate theories to defend their position. Skeptic Interjection 2. How can we know that this passage is a reference to Jesus and not another individual with the name Yeshu? Answer. Though it is possible this passage could refer to another individual, we know Jesus was killed during the Passover. We know he was crucified, a Jewish idiom for hanged. We know he was accused of practicing sorcery by the Pharisees for his miracles. And he was ultimately arrested for the sin of blasphemy, enticing Israel to apostasy. Furthermore, there are other translations which read Yeshu the Nazarene, which give us even more reason to believe that this passage pertains to Jesus. There are many more accounts that refer to Jesus and his existence from the 1st and 2nd century. And this, of course, does not include the many books and letters contained in the New Testament, where even the critics agree it was penned by at least 5 different authors. So we're talking about different letters from different times, claiming to be, in some cases, eyewitness accounts of the historical happenings of the events of this man's life. Some common questions are, why is there no physical evidence or personal writings to verify Jesus' historicity? The Bible has been accused on several occasions of committing historical errors, but has later been proven accurate through archaeological finds. For instance, the Old Testament mentions a tribe of people known as the Hittites. Skeptics pointed out that there was no such civilization in history, yet in the 19th century, records of the Hittites were discovered within Assyrian ruins. Today, we know a lot about the Hittites, such as their language, craftsmanship, geography, and empire chronology. The New Testament mentions the Pool of Bathsheba as a place where Jesus healed a paralytic. No such location was known to exist until it was discovered in Jerusalem as a place where the sick would gather to seek healing. Just because an artifact has not yet been recovered does not mean none exists. In regards to personal writings, Socrates, for example, exists only in the writings of his students. There is not a single document still in existence that contains his original works. If we apply the same logic with Socrates, skeptics use to determine Jesus' historicity, we must assume Socrates was a figment of the imagination of his students. But if we are to accept Socrates as a historical figure based on 4 secondary accounts, We must also accept Jesus as a historical figure whose life was documented by his disciples, historians, and those who rejected his divine claims. In conclusion, a lot of evidence has been presented during this discussion to confirm Jesus Christ as a historical figure. We have viewed accounts taken from numerous authors of different theological backgrounds, and we have answered some common skeptic questions concerning Jesus' historicity. I purposely avoided using biblical evidence to support the existence of Jesus because that would be using the Bible to prove the Bible. Instead, we focused this study on extra-biblical sources. However, early Christian historians and witnesses were unanimous in their accounts that several New Testament books were written by eyewitnesses of both Jesus and the apostolic ministries. If these authors were indeed eyewitnesses, we can believe that they also provide evidence to the historicity of Jesus. Some readers may be satisfied with such evidence, some may not. Whatever the case, I encourage you to examine all the facts for yourself before reaching your conclusion. Thank you.
See, that was just
I would like to present to you a case.
That was just a great little podcast there by Chris White, and it was provided to me by Stephen Rivard. I want to say thank you to Stephen for providing that. I also wanted to share something else with you that's a little bit shorter. Obviously, that was a pretty long podcast, but I've got something a little bit shorter that I wanted to show you that gives some pretty interesting information about the names in the Bible, and you might not have known some of this sort of thing. So I've got very interesting stuff. So I'm just going to scooch on over to that. And this is from Peter Williams. So if you haven't listened to Dr. Peter Williams, I have to admit I've been sort of binge listening to a bunch of his videos and I like them. And I'm going to show you something that he's actually done a while ago. And I just discovered this. And this is on some of the names in the Bible. One of the things that's the big argument in this particular video is the fact that a lot of these names in the Bible are consistent with common names at the time to the same percentage. So let Peter Williams explain. So I'm gonna go to that right now. So hold on, just double check. I've got my sound on. Okay, we're good to go. All righty. So listen to this. This is very impressive. This also gives us some internal credibility. Okay, so a lot of people say, in fact, even in this chat, I've heard people say things like, we don't have eyewitnesses to Jesus's ministry. We don't have contemporaries. Well, of course we do. We know that Matthew and John are of the 12 apostles. Matthew is a tax collector. Some of the information that Matthew provided in his gospel is only in his gospel. Like, for example, the account of the 2 drachma that he found in the fish that they used to pay the taxes, that actually Peter found in the fish. That's something that was only reported by a tax collector. Makes sense, a tax collector would report things like that. He also reports a few other things that correspond to his job of being a tax collector. He also gives a lot of information about what happened after Jesus was resurrected. And he gives a lot of details, just like John did. In fact, those two give more details than Luke and Mark gave, because Luke and Mark were friends of eyewitnesses rather than the eyewitnesses themselves. And so we also have in John, who is a fisherman, he's the only one who gives the account of the fish that Jesus caught after the apostles caught after Jesus resurrected. He actually specified the number of fish, 153. Of course, that's what a fisherman would do. They would actually count the fish to see how many. That's what fishermen do. So it also gives us 2 pieces of evidence that we have a couple of eyewitnesses right there. Of course, that's not even talking about Peter, who's also written in the New Testament. It's not talking about Paul, who pointed out that he also in 1 Corinthians 15, like Peter, like James, Jesus' brother, who also authored a book in the New Testament. These are all eyewitnesses. Okay, so this argument that we don't have eyewitnesses is just ignoring the information that we do have and discounting the Bible. Now, a lot of people say, well, it's a Bible, it's one book. The Bible is actually 66 books written over 1,500 years by over 40 authors in 3 continents, in 3 languages. What's impressive about that is the fact that it's remarkably cohesive. We also have a number of passages that Jesus fulfilled. He fulfilled 330 Old Testament prophecies. Look up Daniel 9. They knew exactly when he was going to arrive. In the year 444 BC, Artaxerxes sent out a decree, and if we count that down from 77's less 7, we can get to the year 33, which is when Jesus was crucified, which was also portended by Daniel in the book of Daniel in 9. Okay, take a look at Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, and Zechariah 12:10 if you want to hear that Jesus was going to be pierced. Okay, hundreds of years prior to even having a crucifixion, that means of punishment being invented by the Persians, we have accounts that Jesus was going to be pierced for our transgressions. And of course he was. So now I'm going to go on to what Peter Williams has said, because this I have not talked about before, and I find this fascinating.
In the Gospels, then we're going to look at a couple more tests after that. The test, do they call people the right thing? Well, do we have anyone here called Michael tonight? Any mics? Do you want to put your hands up? We've got a mic here, yeah? Another mic? Now, I expected there would be some Michaels here. Do you know why? Because we can say that back in the 1970s, 1 in 25 males born in the US was a Michael. That was a very common name. Back then, Jacob wasn't such a common name, but now you change and you look how over from 1967 to 1997, Jacob multiplies by a factor of about 100. So what we can say is names change in frequency over time. And it's not just now, back then they did, although probably not quite as quickly as they do now. So we could ask the question, did the gospel writers give the people the right names? Imagine you had to write a story about people in France 100 years ago. Would you be able to give people the right sort of name? Well, you know, Jacques is a French name. You might know some other French names. Would you be able to get them in the right proportion and frequency? Or for any other country, for that matter? Would you even be able to do it about your own state? The sort of names that people had 100 years ago. Well, people have been able to study personal names recently using archaeology. And there's been a study of about 3,000 names that people were called back then. And we can say that Jewish names in the land of Palestine were different from Jewish names elsewhere. And yet the Gospels and Acts are probably written elsewhere, and yet they've got the right sort of names. That's the remarkable thing we're going to find. They've got the right pattern of names. Let's put some more flesh on that. The argument began with a researcher in Germany, but it's a list simply of all the names that people were called at the time, and so you can go through and get the information. Then along comes a British researcher, and he says, well, let's look at that and correlate that with the Gospels and see if there's any tie-up between what people were called outside the New Testament and what they're called inside the New Testament. And what we find is something rather remarkable. It's a very small chart here, not everyone will be able to see. But basically the most common name inside the New Testament for males, Palestinian Jewish males, is Simon. It's the top name for the New Testament, top name for Josephus, who's a historian of the first century, a Jewish historian, top name in the bone boxes that they had, the ossuaries, and it's the second top name in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We take the second name in the New Testament. It's Joseph. The second most common name, second most common also in Josephus and in the bone boxes. It's the most common one in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We see a significant correlation. Looking at it another way, take the two top Palestinian Jewish male names together and you find nearly 16% of men were called one of those two names. Inside the New Testament it's 18%. We go and take the top 9 men's names together and we find outside the New Testament 41%, inside the New Testament 40%. That is incredibly close, and that is statistically significant because we're using a bigger data sample. As the data sample gets bigger, the numbers get closer. Now let's remember, this is a pattern that's showing up over 4 different writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, writing 5 different books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John and Acts. And what we could say also is those Gospels, those writings, reflect that sort of name pattern individually as well, although obviously the statistics are not quite so great. You don't have such a big sample. With women's names, there's not such a big data sample, but we can say there's a broad correlation. The top woman's name outside the New Testament, Mary. Top woman's name inside the New Testament, Mary. You can say they have less imagination about what to call women, but nearly 29% of women were called one of those top 2 names, 50% one of the top 9 names, and that correlates pretty well with the 40% and 61% you get for those same things inside the New Testament. Bit more variation because the data sample's smaller. So we can look then at the ranks of names, and we can say, look at Jewish males in Palestine, and we could say these are the ranks of the names we've got in the New Testament. And then we could say, let's go to another country where there are lots of Jews in Egypt, and we find a different pattern of names. Now that's a remarkable thing. Now I've got a question here tonight, and it won't work in the overflow, but at least I can find out from people here in the chapel. Does anyone here know anyone called Sabbatai? No one. Anyone Pappus? Ptolemaeus? No? Dog? Not even a pet? No? Okay. Why not? Because the Gospels weren't written about Jewish men in Egypt. If they'd been written about Jewish men in Egypt, sure, those names would have become quite common for us, but they haven't. So in other words, if someone's in a different land, you get a different set of names. Now think about that again. If you had to make up that story about, people in France 100 years ago, would you have got the right sort of names? If you had to write a story about people in Egypt 100 years ago, would you get the right sort of names? You might have some vague idea of Arab names, but would you know how the names in Egypt differ from the names in Jordan, differ from the names in Syria? Unless you've been in those countries, you'd have no idea. And even if you have lived in those countries, I'm not sure your intuitions as to what the most common names would be a very reliable guide. Now again, we've got another survey. We've got some surveys tonight. And one of the surveys I've got is this. Has anyone had the experience of naming a child, giving that child what they thought was an unusual name, only to find out as soon as they've named the child that lots of other children have got the same name? Okay? So we've got at least one here, we've got another one here, another one there, another one there. Yeah, okay. That's right. Why is that? Because our intuitions as to what the most common names are aren't always completely reliable. So that's something that's quite common because our intuitions are just based on a smaller data sample. So even if people were making up stories in the land, they wouldn't be able to get the names in the right proportion. Back then, they didn't have any of those magazines that told you what the most common names were. So what we find is this is a remarkable thing. But
what's really interesting about this, and I think that this is fascinating, and I see that Stephen Steen has also looked at Richard Bauckham, and I haven't. I actually have to get that book. But I wanted to point out something just to add. Something that you might want to notice in the New Testament is we have a lot of very minor characters. And if you think about your life and you think about when you write, say if I were to write something 30 years ago, something today that happened 30 years ago in my life, it's very likely if I wrote, for example, about a party I might have gone to or something like that, I would probably only include the major characters that I remembered in the story, because I wouldn't recall a lot of the minor characters, people who maybe didn't play much of an influence in my life at that particular event. And the same sort of thing is occurring if you look into the New Testament. You're going to notice that a lot of minor characters are mentioned, and they also have distinguished people with very common names with sort of last names or where they came from. So Jesus, if he had to be distinguished, was always Jesus of Nazareth. We have Joseph of Arimathea. We have Simon Peter. We have a number of different ways to distinguish people who had very common names in the New Testament. But the other point that I just want to make is we also have this idea where a lot of minor characters are included, and we don't see the minor characters included. Like, for example, when we talk about the women who went to the empty tomb, in one of the accounts, we have a number of different women who are mentioned. And those are the women, and we have a lot of different minor characters mentioned. So why I'm mentioning that is because when we go later on to the Gnostics, we have very few minor characters, if any minor characters mentioned. And that speaks to the dating, that speaks to early dating, actually. And so that was pretty much what I'm going to show today. I wanted to say thank you so much for everybody for coming in here. Let me go back to the screen and try to find you guys. I'm actually trying to figure out where you are. Let me get this off. Okay, there, I can find the live streaming. Okay, so I'm back to the live streaming right now. Does anybody have any points, comments, anything else you want to make? No, it's okay. So I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. I want to say thank you so much, everybody, for coming on. I want to say a special thanks to Stephen Rivard, who provided me with Chris White's video. Stephen said that Chris White is someone who brought him to Christianity. So hats off to Chris White. I think that's wonderful. I would love to see all of you come to Christianity in the crowd. I want to ask you guys, if you are against coming to Christianity. Why is that? Just think about, why is it that you've decided that you don't want to follow Jesus? We have plenty of evidence extra-biblically, which we provided today. We have internal evidence. I could go on and on about that, but I'm not going to keep talking too much. But I want to say, if you think about it, what's holding you back? So it's an offer that Jesus has made, and it's just merely something you have to say, yes, I accept. So that's all we're going to say. That's all, folks. So please like, subscribe, please come again. And I will talk to you soon. I actually have, tomorrow is Saturday. I'm actually going to be reviewing at 1:30 p.m. Eastern, a video by Lydia McGrew. Lydia McGrew has written a book called The Mirror or the Mask. And it's a book that actually is talking about liberal scholarship and how liberal scholarship is a little bit dangerous in Christianity. Some liberal scholars have found, or have posited, that the gospel authors have taken all sorts of liberties and just made things up to fit a greater narrative, which is kind of crazy. These are even Christian liberal scholars. And so Lydia has done a lot of work to refute that. And I'm going to go over that tomorrow. And Lydia and I are actually going to get together soon. We're trying to plan out a date for her to come back on my channel and to talk more about that, because she's made a video series on that. And on Sunday, I'm going to go on with G-Man and possibly Veckel. I'm going to send Veckel the link too. But G-Man and Veckel and I, possibly Veckel, as I said, are going to be reviewing the Jim Majors Inspiring Philosophy debate. Okay, so we're going to do that on Sunday at 4:00 Eastern. So be sure to come by for that, because that's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to go over that. I actually found that debate to be rather interesting, and so you'll find out why really soon. So please go ahead, like, subscribe, hit that button so you can get alerts whenever I send something out. So tomorrow and Sunday, I hope you'll join. And in case I did see the mention of Michael Heiser, he's coming on my channel on September 16th. So look forward to that. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.